Hello, and welcome to today's webinar all about SBIRT for teens. I'm Tracy McPherson. I'm going to be your webinar facilitator today. If you have any questions about the information that you hear today or have any follow-up questions about the materials or other information you'd like about screening and brief intervention, you are welcome to contact me at any time, or you can respond directly to the emails that you'll be receiving following the webinar. I'm glad to be of additional help to you beyond the webinar, so thank you for joining. And of course, all of our webinars are produced in partnership with many different partners, including NORC at the University of Chicago, the Brief Intervention Group, the National SBIRT, ATTC, NADAC, and SAMHSA. This webinar is part of our 2015 SBIRT webinar series. You're welcome to visit our website and join any of the webinars that we have upcoming. You can see we've had a lot of exciting topics already this year, focusing on health centers. We've had several in our series this year focused on adolescents, so you can pull from March as well as April. And also later in the year, we'll be doing one in August on college students. And you can use those as part of a series to do some self-education. And we have some other topics this year that you may be less familiar with, but we're glad to be able to offer around military and other special populations. So we really hope that you'll take advantage of the free education and the free CEs we're offering and share the information about our webinars to your colleagues. They'll all be available on demand, so if you're not able to join live, you can go ahead and register, and we will follow up with you with an email to let you know that it's happened and where you can access it. So as with all the materials in our series this year and last year and any materials that we have developed and produced as a webinar, we make those available to you on demand, and we house those at our hospital sbirt.webs.com website. So this particular webinar today will have its own special link, so you'll add the /SBIRT-for-teens. You can already find the PowerPoints there. We will post the CE quiz there. That's where the recording will be made available to you. And you can get additional information about the CEs. We're going to leave some time later in the presentation for some questions. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, on the right-hand side is a questions pane. And at any time during the webinar, you don't have to wait till the end. Go ahead and get your questions in the queue. We will take some questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. If we can't and I'm able to answer some of those and follow up, I'd be glad to. If we don't get to your question, you're more than welcome to email me and ask me specifically if something I can't answer. Perhaps Ken will be very kind to indulge me in getting some of your questions answered. And behind the scenes is our technical facilitator, Misty Story. She's the Director of Training and Professional Development at NADAC. And there are questions you have about links to materials or technical things. You can feel free to put those in your chat pane, and she'll be behind the scenes helping you to navigate those. And of course, it's our pleasure to have Dr. Ken Winters today with us, and he will be presenting our webinar today. And Dr. Winters is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota. He's the director of the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research and a senior scientist with the Treatment Research Institute, or TRI, in Philadelphia. He received his BA from the University of Minnesota and a PhD in clinical psychology from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. His primary research interests are the assessment and treatment of addictions, including adolescent drug abuse and problem gambling. His recent work in the field has focused on SBIRT models for adolescents. He's on the editorial board of the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment and the Journal of Child and Adolescent Substance Abuse, and has received numerous research grants from the National Institutes of Health and various foundations. He was the 2008 recipient of the Research to Evidence-Based Practice Award from the National Organization on Effective Treatment for Adolescents, otherwise known as JMATE. And Dr. Winters is a frequent publisher, speaker, and trainer, and he's a consultant to many organizations, including the Hazelden Foundation, the Partnership at drugfree.org, and National Center for Responsible Gaming, and the Mentor Foundation, which is an international drug abuse prevention organization. So it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Dr. Winters today, and he's going to talk to us about SBIRT and teens. So welcome, Dr. Winters, and thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Tracy, thank you so much. And welcome, attendees. Appreciate this opportunity to have this chance to talk about SBIRT. I got to lead off with a few background slides to get us going here. First, I want to acknowledge that we get wonderful support from various organizations in our current research, including the Conrad and Hilton Foundation and National Institute on Drug Abuse. Many other people have helped with this slide presentation today. My great staff here at the University of Minnesota, I call them the Lake Wobegon staff. They're all way above average in intelligence and achievement. There's also the wonderful folks at Kaiser Permanente, my colleagues there, Stacy, Connie, and Andrea, and various other professionals and researchers have helped with this presentation. They probably don't even know how much they've influenced me. I want to give particular acknowledgement to colleagues Tammy Chung and Mike Dennis. So a little bit more about me. As noted, I'm at the University of Minnesota. We run a program called the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research, and there's our website if you want to find out more about us. We have various projects that we're undertaking, including an SBIRT project. I've studied adolescent drug abuse since the mid-1980s, and most of this work is applied research spanning assessment, treatment, prevention. In the last decade or so, I have focused on SBIRT, although as a lot of us in the so-called SBIRT field, we often focus mostly on the BI part of SBIRT, but have now tried to look at the whole model in a little more comprehensive way. Some more introductory points before we drill into the SBIRT topic specifically. One of them is just to bring to light, I think, a couple important points when you're working with a teenager who might have a drug problem. And one, I think, clinical key is to make sure you establish a strong, caring, and empathetic relationship with the teenager. This is such an important feature towards effectiveness that ability to establish empathy may be the most important attribute for success in treatment, perhaps even more important than the particular treatment approach or model that you use. The other thing I want to emphasize when you're working with anyone with a drug problem, including teenagers, I think a key is to help that individual understand what's the functional value of their use, what's driving the reasons why they like to use. It's not just for fun. There can be many other layers to that. And those insights can be launch pads for developing behavior change. They can be your clinical entry points. And I think when you can get an individual who's got a bad habit with drugs to understand the functional value and see if you can convince him or her to break that role that drug is having in their life and find other healthier ways to address those needs, you often can find favorable outcomes. More on that last principle, because for those that have done a lot of brief interventions or similar kind of approaches with teenagers, you know that that's a key pathway to getting a teenager to perhaps see that they have a problem and trying to get them to move forward with some change. All right, a couple slides here on resources. This one points you to some free ones. The first three on my list here are documents that you can download. And so I have the websites for you. The top one, you may know about the TIP series. There are two of them related to teenagers, 31 and 32. 31 will get a little attention later when we talk about screening, but it's a great resource if you want to look at what screening and full comprehensive assessment tools are out there. And that tip has a lot of sample segments of tests or sometimes the full instrument. The next two are recent documents that provide a really nice overview of some basic principles, key elements towards effective treatment. Number two there is from NIDA at drugabuse.gov. The third one, Paving the Way to Change, comes from Treatment Research Institute in Philadelphia. Both of them address adolescent treatment. And then 4 and 5 are websites that provide some nice resources. The Hilton Foundation has started to build a nice link that focuses on SBIRT, and there's the site there. And then NREP is always a handy one to know about. Perhaps most of you know about NREP, a place to find evidence-based treatment approaches. If you go to that site and then just type in the search window brief interventions for teenagers or brief intervention adolescents, it'll point you to the particular programs that have survived the NREP review, have met their criteria for evidence-based, and it allows you to look at a lot of the content, tells you about the user features, and you also get the details of the reviews by independent reviewers, so you can find out what's the good and perhaps the not so good parts of programs. To get an NREP, usually the program has to be manualized, so you're able to at least either obtain or get training to learn particular approaches. More on that later. So my talk is organized around these three themes. I'm going to spend a little time talking about adolescence and some developmental issues. I'll try to point those issues towards their importance for applying an SBIRT model. Then number two big topic is talking about all the components of SBIRT, the screening, the brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And we'll end with a summary. So let's start with an overview of some key developmental issues that I want to highlight. A reminder that the two drugs most abused by teenagers are still alcohol and marijuana, despite trends that are short-term or that are regional, where sometimes a given drug or set of drugs becomes popular, but in most instances it lags behind still the two most popular substances for teenagers, that being alcohol and marijuana. As you may know, marijuana is most likely on the rise, perhaps because the attitudes in America are going in the more pro-marijuana direction, but alcohol is still the substance used and abused by teenagers the most. These percentages are the national data from Monitoring the Future study. They're just the 12th graders, and it's just past year. So keep in mind, if I was showing you the data for 10th or 8th graders, those percentages would be less, and if I showed you data for past 1 month, the percentages would be lower. The drug on here, the drug that's not on here is tobacco. That's, however, an addictive drug that teenagers do use quite a bit. It's apparently Monitoring the Future doesn't ask about prior year for tobacco use, so it doesn't show up on this chart. Another developmental point is to bring home the principle that early use probably has a downstream negative impact. This is one way of looking at it. There are 3 lines here. You can see all of them angled downward. That's because the direction of the lines all point to the basic principle that the earlier that use starts, the more likely or the higher prevalence rate that you'll have a lifetime problem. And this is the lines for alcohol. And so you can see whether you have parent history, which is in the green line, or no parent history, which is the blue line, red being the average. You can see that the trend follows the following. The later you can wait to use alcohol, at least the lower your prevalence for an alcohol problem throughout your life. Many factors are at play here, and it isn't necessarily just the early alcohol use being the main driver of these data. It could be a significant marker of other underlying factors. But it is remindful that earlier we can screen and intervene, the better, and perhaps we're helping an individual with not only their short-term problem, but also the long-term trajectory that he or she may or may not have. The next developmental principle, I just want to remind us all that adolescence is an interesting biological period, not just because of hormone development and other biological changes, but also because of brain development. And the recent science suggests that the youth brain develops significantly in the teen years and isn't fully complete for all the major maturation processes until about age 25. So adolescence is a time of great change, and with the brain changing in significant ways, that likely impacts how we perceive behavior and attitudes, as well as clinically how we respond. And throughout the talk, I'm hoping you'll see how I see SBIRT models as very teen brain friendly in ways. Well, one of the principles coming out of this brain development science is that the teen brain develops differentially across regions. So not all regions are maturing at the same rate or at the same intensity. And it looks like the limbic parts of the brain, which sort of have to do with motivation, emotion, physical activity, things that I kiddingly call the Nike part of your brain, the part of the brain that tells you to go for it or just do it. That matures a little sooner in the teen years, as opposed to the part of the brain that tells you to pause and reflect, that helps inform what's called second thoughts. It probably weighs in heavily, that part of the brain, the front part, when you're faced with an impulse, when you're deciding whether you should delay or not a moment of gratification. So when you have these differential maturation processes, or this imbalance, that likely leads to perhaps a teenager that's a little bit more interested in taking risk, seeks sensation, perhaps more likely, and may choose to use drugs when he or she hasn't thought it through very well. By the way, this slide is of a bungee jump, particular one that had you could go up a little higher than the usual place on this this bungee jump, and they give you a bicycle, and then you ride the bike down a ramp, and right here when the photo was taken, you basically drop the bike, that falls into a net, and then the youngster is headed outward, gets to sort of fly out into space as opposed to just dropping straight down. So they get a little extra buzz from your standard bungee jump. When I was watching this, I didn't see any adults waiting in line for this part of the bungee jump. It looked like the kind of thing the teenagers and the teen brain were really enjoying. Another way of looking at maturation is through this time-lapse representation of pruning. That's a major maturation process that occurs during adolescence, where the brain is sculpting and getting rid of excess density, excess synaptic connections, and it's allowing the ones already used to get stronger. And this imbalance of maturation is shown here. As you can see, it's sort of an enveloping process, with the parts getting blue sooner have more to do with motor coordination, emotion, and motivation, and the parts that are getting blue later in this time-lapse series have more to do with judgment. So underlying all this is this principle of brain plasticity, this maturation process. Plasticity occurs throughout all of life. This is where you're losing neurons and generating new ones. But during adolescence, this process is most certainly occurring at a higher speed. So why am I telling you all this? Well, I think it just reinforces the importance of appreciating the value of addressing teenagers when things are not going so well in life, because it likely means when there is exposure to stress, when they're doing things themselves that are risky, this could have an important, profound impact on brain development. And so correcting these risky behaviors, correcting habits that teenagers are engaging in that might be causing the risk, such as using drugs, can help correct or help forestall any neurological pathway or development that might actually lead to further deficits or lead to more problems. So it's a time of opportunity, both for negative things to have a big impact, but also an opportunity for positive things to have a favorable impact. And counseling, of course, can be one of those positive influences. Another way, and it's my last slide about brain development, is to show you this list of 8 things. We looked at the developmental psychology literature to see how experts are thinking about brain development and the implications it has on behavior. And this is a summary of where we saw some of the main themes emerging from this literature. And you can see when you look at all 8 of them, they tell us really a lot about being a teenager, but not in new ways. There's nothing really a great news bulletin in this list. When you think back to long-standing writings about youth, or you reflect on your own youth, you probably see yourself in many of these features here. But it reminds us that some of these attributes of adolescence might have their basis in brain development. Also, I think the list shows us where there's opportunity for counseling to have an impact, but it also may represent where there are some challenges. So number 3, preference for activities with peers that trigger high intensity and arousal. Well, if teenagers prefer peers, spending time with peers, that means it can be tough for an adult to sit them down and see if they want to make changes in their life. So that, that poses for us adult counselors some challenge. But on the other hand, teenagers have a preference for novelty. Well, sometimes counseling is pointing a teenager towards something new in life, a way to look at something in a different way, trying something different, like finding new friends, finding a new way to deal with problem A or problem B, or coping in a different way. So we're often asking a client to try something new, so capitalizing on any of their tendency towards novelty might be an advantage for us when we're working with young people. Sometimes it's hard to get the adults to want to change their habits because they're so long-standing, and perhaps the interest in novelty isn't so great. Also, number 8 can be used as an ally, because teenagers can also take healthy risks. Not all risk is negative, so sitting down with an adult to talk about change, maybe that adult is a stranger, well, that's a bit of a risk, but you might be able to capitalize on teenagers who are willing to give it a try and maybe give some new behaviors a try, even though they might think it's a risk. So one way to look at that prior list of 8 is that during the teen years there is, in many ways, a preference for reward incentives, and those preferences are greater than perceptions of consequences. So let's get to the heart of the talk, and this is going through the full SBIRT model. And so first, some introductory thoughts. This is my metaphor for SBIRT, the Swiss Army knife. I think it fits nicely when we think about what is SBIRT and why do people like it. SBIRT, like a Swiss Army knife, I think is a handy tool, and I think it's a good tool for all clinicians to have in their clinical toolbox. Like a Swiss Army knife, SBIRT I think has high utility value. Can be used in a lot of different settings. It's, I think, applicable to a wide range of individuals. So it can serve many purposes also. Some people use the SBIRT model when they may know that this individual is going to need more than just the brief intervention, but they're using it to see if you can kickstart that individual along a momentum of change, of behavior change. Perhaps, though, you have somebody who's ready for change, and so the SBIRT model can really fit in nicely if you want to then continue to encourage the action that the person's already started to take. And as we'll talk later, SBIRT can be used also as a vehicle to convince the teenager and or the parent to seek more treatment. I think SBIRTs have many teen-friendly features. More on that in a moment. The SBIRT model has been used more with adults. There's more adult literature. Its use with young people, I think, is more emerging. Even within youth, there's more literature on its use with college students, particularly the binge drinking issue, than there are with teenagers. The data are promising, but it's early. It's very, very early of a 9-inning ball game when we look at the extent of efficacy data, treatment efficacy data with the use of this model with teenagers as compared to its use with adults. But there are a lot of ongoing studies, particularly with the help of Conrad Hilton Foundation, and looking at how this model can be used with teenagers. The part of the model that's been studied the least is the RT part, the referral to treatment. So there's quite a bit on screening and more on brief intervention, but very little formally on the referral to treatment component. So more on why I think SBIRT is accommodating for teenagers. Most SBIRT models for the counseling part, they use the motivational interviewing technique. I think that's very appealing for teenagers because the counseling is not so much the adult leading things, but it has the teenager more at the center. Of course, a brief intervention is not asking someone to commit to something lengthy. That can be appealing to teenagers. Often, young people with a drug problem are seen in an opportunistic setting, schools, detention centers, pediatric clinics, etc., where a simple screen can be done easily, and you might then have an opportunity to sit down for a brief conversation or something more extended. And I think, as I'll point to in a moment, there's a lot of young people that I think hit the sweet spot for where a brief intervention fits in terms of their level of drug use. So to drill deeper into that last topic of how brief interventions might be very accommodating to a reasonably high percentage of young people, let me start with this slide with the help of Tammy Chung, who provided the basis for it. There's a lot here. On the far left, you see this triangle, upright triangle, with a lot of different colors. And then to the right, I've got what the definition might be of some of these bands. So if you start at the bottom with the turquoise and green, which represents the bulk of the triangle, for me that represents a lot of teenagers who either haven't used a substance in the recent period, or if they've used, it's very infrequent. But then as you get into the higher up, into the narrower groups, then you start to get individuals that represent greater involvement with substances, all the way from regular substance use, and if you go from yellow all the way up to crimson, those that meet a DSM-5 definition a severe version of a substance use disorder. So there's 6 different groups here, all representing from no use all the way up to the most severe use, and you can see how my kind of rough metaphorical emphasis is on the prevalence rates. But there are some numbers we can put to this. And for this slide, this is talking about what percent roughly might be at the 2 endpoints, which is not really the sweet spot for brief intervention. So at the bottom, the roughly 70%-ish of teenagers within the past year might report that they haven't used or are very infrequent users. And for those individuals, perhaps not enough use to apply an SBIRT model. At the very top end, you have roughly 5% as an estimate of those that meet the DSM-5 definition of a severe substance use disorder. Just one caveat with this, these are estimates. They're rough estimates. I took them from some national data, but it's also national data that lumped 12 to 18-year-olds. So if I was to show you this for high school seniors, well, it would look a little different, wouldn't it? You'd have a little bit higher percent of those at the top. And if I was to show you this for 13-year-olds, you'd have, much smaller percent at the top and a larger percentages at the bottom. But I'm trying to make a point here. There's perhaps some teenagers, either they're not using or they're using so infrequently it might not merit a brief intervention. And those at the top, well, they might need something more intensive than a brief intervention. But more, particularly later, as we talk about applying brief interventions, if you turn out that you have a teenager with a severe problem, because there is still a pathway within the brief intervention model that could be applied. But I want to, at least to help guide our thinking, identify what I'm calling the sweet spot for the SBIRT model, and this would be teenagers that fit these 3 groups. Either they're a regular substance user, so regular, perhaps weekly, maybe even more frequently, but some of them might not meet one of the substance use disorder criteria, so I give them a separate status. And then there's the mild and moderate version of a substance use disorder. If you know, DSM-5 now no longer has abuse and dependence, so if you have a mild or moderate form of a substance use disorder, you have roughly between 2 and 6 symptoms out of the 11. Old language might mean that they have more abuse than dependent symptoms, or if you have the dependent symptoms, you have just a few of them. I think that likely fits more of what would be considered the sweet spot for a brief intervention. And you can see that could be roughly 20-ish% of teenagers. With the help of Mike Dennis, just a reminder that brief interventions can be applicable to all age groups, but you could make a case that they're very applicable to young people, and among age groups within our population, that might be the age group for which there are the greater percentage of individuals for which a brief intervention makes the most sense. Okay, so let's get into each of the components of SBIRT, and we'll start out with screening. A reminder, so what is screening? It's a probabilistic enterprise, so at the problem identification level, you're not being definitive, but you're trying to measure briefly and accurately, but it's very probabilistic. So if somebody, though, had screened positive, a next step might be a brief intervention, and the next step after that, which I'm calling referral, well, that could mean you could do more of your brief intervention. You might have booster sessions, or you might need to refer the person on for treatment. We'll talk more about the referral category later. It's also possible that at the screening level, there may be so many problems that you realize this person needs more assessment right away, and that a brief intervention might not be the best clinical step to take, but for such individuals, you realize there's so many problems and there's screening, red flagging in such a dramatic way that you make a choice to have the person get a comprehensive assessment. And that person, after a comprehensive assessment, they may need referral to treatment. So I want to distinguish it from formal assessment or comprehensive assessment. There, that process is more definitive. Usually the next step is referral to treatment, and their decisions are made about to what extent or what the priorities for treatment are, and often a person then gets continuing care after primary treatment. The good news is that there are a lot of good screening tools out there for teenagers that have favorable psychometric properties. I have 6 of them up here that I like. They've all been studied with teenagers and have very favorable properties. Some of them are much shorter than others. Some of them are a bit longer, but most of them, I think, fit the notion of a screening tool that's relatively quick and efficient. I'm going to focus on 2 of them. One of them is the 6-item CRAFFT, very accurate for 6 items. John Knight and his research group have done an excellent job, I think, with this. You can see each letter stands for a key word in the question. You could ask this in an interview format or turn this into some self-administered type situation. I think for teenagers it can be helpful to have them take some of these type assessments and screens in a self-administered format. That private type administration strategy can be very helpful for getting good self-report. But 2 or more yeses tend to suggest a red flag, so that could mean that it merits sitting down with a person and starting to engage in a brief intervention process. I'm showing you the heads screener just to remind you that if you're interested in more screening than just drug abuse, the heads provides an alternative. Each of these letters stands for a key content area that you'd want to address with a teenager. If you Google heads, you'll find several structure or semi-structured interview formats organized around this. And of course the questions are pretty logical, but it's nice to see what some people have thought of as they realize, okay, I want to ask about 4 or 5 questions per category. What are the best ones, and what's the order to ask them in? So you can see there's the D for drugs, but there's many other important categories that are worthy of assessment if you have an opportunity to do a bit more than just a very brief screen. So a heads interview might take you, could take you a full hour if a teenager is extremely verbal and providing a lot of detail. But this would be more likely to be a 15-20-minute interview. Which leads me just to remind you all that screening for teenagers with a possible drug problem does beg the question, well, should I screen for other disorders? Because other disorders so often co-occur with a teenager who's having a problem with drugs. I'm listing here 5 common other disorders, and it is a question you'd want to ask yourself, do you have the wherewithal, the screening tools, do you have the time to screen for other disorders? There are instruments out there that can provide what are the 3 or 4 type questions to ask for these core disorders. The GAIN short screen is one of them that does a nice job providing a format for that. But some of us don't have the time or feel like we have the skill to do it, so that's always something you want to put in the back of your mind, that maybe you want to refer a teenager to someone else who can provide this type of assessment. But I pose it as a question, something to keep in mind. There are many things you can do to enhance self-report. Even at a brief screening level, I have several of them up here. Building rapport, establishing confidentiality, reinforcing the personal benefits and relevance of an assessment, using a standardized test. Just that alone is good. If that test has a scale to measure invalid reporting, that's a plus. Sometimes you have to adjust the screening and assessment process based on the teenager's learning and reading ability. If you don't think you had a good read of the teenager with the first time through of a screening, you could repeat the testing. And you could collect urine and test it for drugs. Keep in mind, though, that's a task that is only going to give you whether the drug was recently used or not, or at least used within the time window of that given screen. And so it provides you limited data. You've got to keep that in mind. But studies suggest that correlates with self-report, and if a teenager knows they're getting a urine sample collected, they tend to report a little bit higher rates of drug use, which many have interpreted as meaning you're probably getting more valid information. Interesting, though, if you compared hits with the urine test versus self-reporting of using or not using, you get more reports of use with the self-report than you would if you just looked at the results of a urine test. So in many ways, I think that reminds us, if you've built good rapport, you often can get relatively honest disclosure by a teenager. All right, let's move to the heart of SBIRT, which is brief intervention. As noted, I think this model has some promise with adolescents. It's still early, though, so I put the caveat that we have to still be watchful of how the research unfolds in this area. If you looked at the literature, I think you'd come away with these observations that I have, that existing applications have tended to be used in opportunistic settings. So that usually means that drug use has already been disclosed in some way, so the cat's out of the bag in most instances. Parents may already know about drug use. The teenager might be feeling some pressure to get help because perhaps this opportunistic setting meant there were consequences. In many instances, they've been used with early stage users or those that screen for mild or moderate drug involvement. The use of them as a standalone for teenagers that have a dependence or the severe version of substance use disorder, that's very limited in the literature. More on that soon. But a reminder, I think the brief intervention has a nice home in this so-called sweet spot of youngsters that are showing this mild, moderate drug involvement. Usually means it's early use. Usually means they don't have loss of control or preoccupation. They might not yet be polydrug user. The consequences haven't stacked up. There might be early consequences. Parents are complaining. They're perhaps using during the school week, maybe even using before school. They haven't yet, gotten in trouble with the law. These kinds of things usually reflect this early stage use. A reminder, what are some of the attractive features of it for teens? You're just asking the teenager to commit to something short-term, so if they're reluctant to engage in the counseling process, you're not asking someone to engage in it for a long period of time. The model tries to be very client-centered or person-centered, not therapist-centered, so it tends to, I think, give teenagers a little more comfort because they don't feel like it's just an adult telling them what to do. Also, the use of it means you want to make it flexible, and you can make this flexible in many different ways. I think the biggest one is you use it in a way to negotiate goals with a teenager that is something that the teenager is willing to try and willing to say, I'll give that, that homework assignment a good old college try, because you've set a goal at something they think is realistic and meaningful to them. Now that means it's going to vary across teenagers. Might also mean that you're at least initially negotiating a harm reduction or risk reduction goal as opposed to abstinence. You have to be careful with that. You got to be comfortable with it. We never finish our time with a teenager in a brief intervention without talking about abstinence, even though perhaps we've discussed goals that reflect risk reduction. Even if a teenager doesn't want to go abstinence, we have them talk about, well, what would that be like for you? So, and what are you concerned about if you had to give up drugs altogether? What would be the challenges? These are the kinds of questions we ask when we get a teenager to talk about it. I think it's important to do that, even if you're not going to see abstinence in your client. I think it's helpful to lay down some of these mustard seeds for abstinence that might occur later. Just a couple slides on implementation challenges. There may be a lot of settings in which the opportunity to do a brief intervention presents itself, but staff might not be trained yet. For some settings, it perhaps is difficult to apply even some counseling because there just isn't enough time. I think pediatric clinics are such settings where you might have a lot of teenagers that fit. There might be staff that are easily trained or even pretty good at counseling, but it may be very incompatible with a particular clinic model. There is concern in some settings that you might not get reimbursed for the service, or if you are reimbursed, it's at such a low level that it disincentivizes application of the model. But I think this is getting changed as we're with the expanded healthcare laws, both the parity as well as Affordable Care Act. We're seeing that there is greater eligibility for screening and addiction-related counseling within reimbursable services. The literature is promising in that it looks like the model, though, if it can find a sweet spot, find a way to get implemented, that can occur reliably with fidelity across many different kinds of settings. I've listed some of them here. If you read the literature, you'll see examples spanning from medical clinics all the way to school health clinics. It's baseball season, so let me characterize how I see the research literature on brief interventions for teenagers in baseball language. When positive results are found, I think the size of the positive effects, or the so-called effect sizes, are in the moderate range. I would consider that more like hitting doubles and triples. I don't think it's common to find home runs or extreme dramatic effects. My read of the literature is that for severe end cases you find less positive effects as opposed to those that are showing mild or moderate severity levels. And if you survey the types of strategies and approaches used, it's very common you see motivational interviewing as a key, and the use of decisional balance exercise. We'll return to those real soon. Some exceptions that are worthy of your consideration, as at least a standalone approach that where you didn't have a referral to treatment in mind. I don't think it's advisable just to apply a brief intervention when you have a teenager with a substance use disorder at the severe end. And a reminder, if you have somebody with a lot of other problems, and maybe these other co-occurring problems dominate the clinical picture, and the drug use is even less severe than these other problems, you don't want to go into using a brief intervention thinking that'll be all that's needed. Could be leveraged to get the teenager to realize they need more help, either by you or referring for additional specialized treatment. So I'll just summarize 3 common elements of brief intervention. One of them is what looks to be pretty typical, and that's where you negotiate goals. I like the decisional balance exercise as a way to gather material to help develop goals. This exercise is a very nice way to open up a line of discussion about drug use with a person. You start out with the pros, what you like about drug use, what are the good things about using, and you get a lot of detail there, and then you move into the negatives. So what don't you like as much? What are the not so good things? What else? So you get, two ways of looking at the drug use experience with the person. The pros help you with the functional value, and the cons help you with, are there any consequences yet? For teenagers, you might not have a lot of consequences. That's okay. Usually young people are able to give you plenty of pros, and they can be useful because they can tell you about the either psychological or the coping or the social underlying value of the drug involvement by the teenager, and these are clinical entry points for you because you can try to then organize goals around on ways that they can address some of these functional values in other healthier strategies and ways. A common interviewing approach is motivational interviewing. This, I think, is a very teen-friendly approach to counseling. It may even be a better interviewing strategy than the original authors had thought for teenagers. I think the core literature on motivation interviewing was really thinking of adults, but it's a great way to, I think, get teenagers to connect with you. These are 5 reasons why I like motivational interviewing for teenagers. They represent some of the core features of this approach. I've mentioned them already. A lot of these things, for just to emphasize a couple of them, it's a way to, I think, get a teenager to feel like you as the adult isn't foisting your values on him or her, getting them to think about themselves as part of the solution. So you want to, even though they might not come up with a very ambitious goal or a goal that is really one you're comfortable talking about, you want to flatter the young person that they're part of the solution, and they may have even some great ideas about what they can do if they want to make some changes. So good counselors take these goals from a teenager, and if they're not so ambitious or they're perhaps not healthy enough, and you try to nudge or shape them towards something that's a bit more ambitious and something you're more comfortable with. And some of us are in settings where abstinence has to be the goal. And so you don't necessarily start out by forcing that on the teenager. You talk about what they could do about their drug problem. What might there be things they could do to reduce the risk or the harm? And you get them to talk about that, and then nudge them towards, all right, what would it be like if you didn't use altogether? Move them, shape them towards that discussion. And then a reminder that many brief interventions use principles from cognitive behavioral therapy, a wonderful clinical approach where you get the person to focus on specific problems that are immediate and relevant. And then you work with, okay, what are some solutions that are realistic for this person? They're so specific that they'll know what we're talking about. It's not vague. It means that there's really going to be a homework assignment or assignments from it. And it means so that the person has to take some action, that they're going to be responsible for the change. And I look at this list and I realize that this is also very adolescent friendly. Because teenagers, it looks like the literature suggests, if you want to engage them in behavior change, you have to make it meaningful for them. It has to be relevant to their life. It has to be something very specific. You know, it can't be abstract. And it has to, you know, having an action component means that, you know, they feel like that they can get some responsibility for it. And teenagers like that when they feel like, well, they're part of the solution. It's not just they're following a game plan of an adult, but they're having some ownership of it. Now, another feature of behavior change for adolescents is it needs to have a fun component to it. Now, counseling isn't necessarily fun inherently, but to the extent that you can make it entertaining, engaging, and that you can also come up with solutions that, you know, are have at least a recreational or a fun component to it, it probably means you're improving the interest level of your teenager in the goals. So let me go to now the last part of SBIRT, the RT, referral to treatment. So here I've just come up with a very simple model of how you might look at referral to treatment. So there's 4 possible, I see, outcomes that might come from your engaging a teenager in a screening and a brief intervention process. So let's say you've done the SBI and you have a favorable outcome with a brief intervention. I think the next step, or the RT part, would be really just supporting the good progress you've made, supporting their continued healthy behaviors. But let's say in the brief intervention there's not much change at all, or no change. Well, then I think you want to consider a more clinically or behavior change next step, and that could include conducting a booster session, convincing the person to come on back. So in that sense, it's sort of an internal referral to treatment. Or you might realize that this person's going to need a lot more services, perhaps more specialized, or something beyond what your clinic can handle or your caseload can handle. And so there you might see if you can get the person referred for services elsewhere. Another possibility is that the problem even gets worse. And so there you realize, yes, this person really does need more services. And then at the bottom I posed the possibility that at the screening level you might have seen there's so many red flags. You might have done a brief intervention, and maybe you did some nice progress with the drug issue, but you realize that though the youngster might have a lot of other problems, and that suggests that at minimum you want to refer that person for more assessment so they can get a comprehensive, a full-blown assessment, which is really several hours of a very you know, rigorous overview of the teenager's life and their health and well-being. So a reminder, the referral to treatment component, it's the least studied part of the SBIRT model. Before we get a lot of research on how to parlay the RT part, I think you can rationally look at what makes sense clinically. My prior slide was just my effort of coming up with a common sense protocol and how you might look at ways to take that next step. It's always, though, something to worry about with this last bullet I have here. If you are referring someone elsewhere for treatment, are there services available? Do you have a logical or realistic referral to offer that teenager or that family? So yeah, I think it behooves you, if you really get into this model and you realize that you won't have all the services perhaps in-house if you don't have it within a comprehensive setting. You want to do your homework and see what's in the community and see what are some logical options. So you don't want to have the situation where you're telling the teenager or the family you need more services and you got to find, you know, someone who's skilled in assessment or treatment. You want to be able to say, okay, here's a list of professionals or local programs, and here's their perhaps the the extent to which they cover either Medicare or Medicaid, or the requirement for private insurance, and so that the family at least is informed about what they might be faced if they're going to tap into community services. So in some ways you're providing some counseling, some health service delivery counseling, and you want to do some homework so you have some of the specifics about what's available and what might the cost be and other barriers. So let me summarize. I think the SBIRT model is an interesting and promising and emerging set of tools that can help address drug use among teenagers, among a wide band of teenagers. And by addressing early stage drug use, we have the potential for significant public health impact. There are many models that exist that are either evidence-based or evidence-informed. I suggest you go to NREP, for example, or read some of the other documents that I mentioned, and you can find some good examples. But be cautious. We don't know yet a lot about SBIRT with young people. They clearly have their limitations, and for some teenagers, it really would just be the first step in what might mean for them and that family more extended counseling and treatment. Okay, thank you for the opportunity, and wide open here for some discussion from the group.
Great, thank you, Dr. Winters. I'm going to take a look here to see if some questions are coming in. I just want to remind folks to use your questions pane. And if you've had your hand raised, we're not going to unmute the line. So we would ask that you submit your question or comment in the questions pane in the same way you would ask a typical question. So let me take a look here and look at see what kind of questions that we have coming in. One question, and I get this question as well, is when you're thinking about how to define the level of use that would be risky for an adolescent. We have different government agencies that say, okay, this amount of alcohol or this amount of marijuana use would be considered low risk or within the guidelines. When you think about adolescents, I mean, we know from a policy perspective it might be 0 is the guideline, no consumption. But when you define low-risk use or infrequent use, what does that actually mean? Is that a certain amount, a quantity, or a frequency, or is it only applied to certain substances like alcohol?
Yep. Yeah, it gets complicated. Excellent points. And I know I was advancing the argument that there might be this so-called infrequent use type behavior that perhaps isn't the sweet spot for brief intervention. But it is quite rational for any health professional or youth-serving professional, when there's any use of any substance by a young person, to engage in a conversation about the relative merits of that behavior. Even a 10-minute conversation along the lines of the illegal nature of what they might be doing, as well as the potential for that infrequent use to escalate and become a problem, is clinically rational and makes a lot of sense from a public health standpoint. It can be difficult to engage, I think, a teenager at the low level of use in a like a 2 or 3 session brief intervention model, and some models out there are organized around that, and that usually requires for that model to be appropriate to have higher use and to already have some consequences. So I don't want to advance the argument that you can't or that you shouldn't engage in a conversation about the health risk of any use in a teenager if that use has already started. When we study, in some groups are looking at the mild moderate, so-called mild moderate using teenager. For those teenagers, usually consequences have already started, and so and that's because they're using you know, at a regular or semi-regular basis, which usually means at least weekly. If they're using monthly or less than weekly, though they're using very heavily. So, and so obviously frequency and quantity have a role in all of this. There's, I don't think, any really hardcore definitive lines in the sand that tell us, well, when is it not a danger and when is it a danger. It can depend on what drug, how often, and if it's done heavily. I know if you have someone that's 11, 10, 11, or 12, and they're already starting to sip and like the effects of just sipping alcohol, that's a red flag. If they're that young and their peers are using, that's also another important red flag. And so conversations about staying healthy and not extending that use or being very wary of their falling into a pattern that their friends are falling into, that's a very worthy conversation to have. So in this light, if you look at an expanded view of a brief intervention, you surely can talk and have conversations with a young person, even if they are at that infrequent use level, which wasn't my sweet spot, you know, 40 minutes ago.
That's very helpful. And I got a question last week about adolescents, and well, they only use once a month, but they go out and somehow are in a car with someone who has been drinking, or this is a new driver and they're behind the wheel. You know, even if it's only one time, it's an opportunity, and even if technically it's low risk, it would perhaps warrant having that conversation with the child. And so yeah, I think it's just interesting, as I haven't seen a lot of guidelines, formal guidelines on exactly how the cutoffs are, but we do get some of these risk bands that you gain from some of these different screening tools, which are useful, but some of it is clinical judgment, and it's really helpful to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Let me just follow up. People may know about NIAAA's guidelines to address alcohol use by young people, and they've done a nice job of what to do at certain ages and what type of questions to ask and what are red flags. And those questions and red flags vary, you know, based on age. And so you know, and they recommend, you know, even a brief conversation makes sense with teenagers that might look like they're low-end users, but they at a given age, and being the alcohol having the nature it does, it makes sense to have these conversations.
Yeah, I'll make sure I post a link of that guide that you're talking about. I think that can be very useful. I'll put that over in the chat pane. I think that's where I can do it, and I'll post a link to that, because that could be helpful for folks to see that resource. Those are available for free, those guides. You can download them. They're on the web. You can order copies of those. While I paste that, I'll ask you another question that's come in. You mentioned the CRAFFT and the GAIN SS and several other tools. We have a couple of questions about the screening tools. One of them is, about the heads. Have you seen this been used as like a validated screening tool, or is it used more like a surveillance tool to just gather information to determine whether you should screen? Could you comment on that?
Right. The heads is a semi-structured interview, I would consider it. It doesn't have, that I know of, the kind of metrics that the other screeners had on there, where you have scores and cut points and suggested descriptors for cut points. I think all the other ones on my list provide users with that kind of metric detail. The heads is a door opener, an opportunity to engage in a discussion about a lot of different topics related to a teenager's life and their health. As you noted, it's got a lot of topics related to context, because even drug use alone isn't as, or at least information about a teenager's drug use can vary, and our interpretation of it can vary based on the context. So that's more of a door opening clinical interview, the heads, and surely could suggest to you, oh, maybe I need to use some of these standardized assessment instruments, and maybe more than one, because you realize from the heads that, oh, I've got perhaps multiple issues going on here with a teenager, so I might get more comprehensive than just a single drug screen.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And another question about the screening tools, in terms of a newer tool that's recently come out of Boston Children's Hospital and Sharon Levy's group, the S2BI. What are your thoughts about that tool? Are you seeing that in use? Would that, I know it's a newer tool, maybe you could comment on that tool.
It's excellent. My understanding is it's a next generation of the CRAFFT type instrument. I think it might have some core CRAFFT items, but that's excellent work done by the Sharon Levy, John Knight Children's Hospital group. So yeah, it's another outstanding tool. I don't know it as well as the others, so I didn't put it on the list, but it's a very strong instrument from what I can tell.
Yeah, it sounds, I've seen a lot of folks talk about the CRAFFT. That's been used a lot, and the GAIN tool actually I've seen used less often in other settings, although there's so much evidence around the use of the GAIN SS. A lot of normative data, validation, a lot of psychometric studies. It's been used in trials at NIH, and I'll try to find a link to that as well and post it for folks, and also for the CRAFFT. I don't think I have a copy of the Adolescent DAS. I'll see if I can find that, and we'll try to put some of these tools up on our website so folks can link to them. But all of these are it sounds like are all good options, and it seems like they appeal to different groups depending perhaps on the setting, maybe how long or how short they are, but all of them seem to be really good options. So thanks for presenting multiple choices. Let's see if I have any other screening related questions here. I think there is a question here just about the use of screening tools in general, whether they are recommended to be more broadly implemented for all adolescents as just a standard practice, or really should it be employed during those opportunistic settings? Where would you suggest either their evidence is, or just from a public health perspective, what would be your guidance on that? Everybody or just a targeted group?
Yeah, good question. Some of them are very accommodating to easily insert among just a general health overview, health assessment. So in many settings, one would likely suspect that a reasonable proportion of teenagers have drug use in their history and maybe even starting to show some early problems. So in that kind of situation, in that context, it makes sense to include it as a routine part, because many other behavioral and health issues are probably going to be assessed, and so it's a natural to insert it. In some settings, you know, for example, some school clinics where there's a suspected problem of drugs, so then it might, in that kind of situation, perhaps just a screening for drug problems as a single issue perhaps is logical. But even there in school health clinics, you might realize, hey, let's have the youngsters sit down. You know, we got, even though there's perhaps a drug violation, it might be a drug problem, let's screen for some of the other things that often occur. And so it's a natural to figure out where you can insert it as a routine part of already a health assessment that a teenager is going to receive.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see here if I have any more questions that have come in about the screening per se. No, I think that's all I've seen on screening so far. Let's take some questions in sort of another area here. Let me make sure, I might just have to reword this slightly here. Is there any experience with using SBIRT in school settings? This person is working in a local school district and working to try to implement the SBIRT model in middle and high school for kids who've been suspended for alcohol and drug-related reasons. Can you talk a little bit about the use of SBIRT in schools?
So yeah, that's, I think, a growing trend. I'd like to hope it is. And there's some wonderful examples out there. Tracy, I'll send you a link to a special issue that looked at school health clinics.
That'd be great.
And the role that those clinics can play in drug abuse intervention as well as mental health. There's some interesting challenges in the school, but it's a opportunistic setting, and I encourage those that are working with schools or in school health clinics to consider the opportunity you have to apply the SBIRT model. It's likely, if you're a school health clinic, you have mental health counselors, social workers, etc. on staff, so learning the SBIRT skills is, I think, going to be quite easy or relatively easy. So the workforce capacity ought to be there. The teenagers in the school building, so you perhaps have opportunity to find 50 minutes, for example, before they go home. Getting the parents involved is a huge plus. A lot of schools and the school health clinics want parent involvement. That can be a big advantage for getting effectiveness out of your brief intervention. So a lot of opportunities in schools.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Conrad Hilton Foundation and the work they're doing. I was just thinking about that. We're also working with Conrad Hilton Foundation to integrate education around screening and brief intervention in schools of nursing and schools of social work. And I was thinking about some of the other grantees. They're the School-Based Health Alliance, for those who are really interested in this setting. And I've seen, like you, a real growing interest and people trying it, hotspots of activities, I like it to call it. The School-Based Health Alliance also has a grant from the Conrad Hilton Foundation. You can Google that. And they are actually working with quite a few health centers in schools to implement it, to train and look at the lessons learned and building in their own evaluation of it, you might be able to connect, for those interested, with the School-Based Health Alliance and learn more about what they're doing, some of the tools that they're using, and some references so we can try to help cross-pollinate and what you're doing with what they're doing. One of the other things I was thinking about, we did, if you Google the National SBIRT ATTC and the Youth Learning Community, there we recently had Brett Harris do a webinar and some of the experiences that she's had in school-based health centers in New York. And there's a PowerPoint and an on-demand webinar that talks about some of the evidence and does have some summaries of the hotspots of activities that are happening in health centers. So I think you're going to be seeing more and more around this, and it does appear to be a promising venue. So thank you for the person who posed that question. I think many can benefit from that, and thank you, Dr. Winters, for your response on that.
Let me follow up with one other point. That question reminded me of, if you're in various settings like a school setting and you don't have perhaps the luxury of a formal multi-session brief intervention program, and there are packages out there for that and protocols, but let's say you have an opportunity for a brief conversation with a youngster. I would organize that conversation around the decisional balance exercise. I would use that structure to get the youngster to talk about their use on the two levels, the pros and the cons, and then it lends itself to the counselor or the therapist to talk about at least one thing the teenager can think about changing, because you're probably going to get enough information from that exercise that lends itself to one possible change that's in the healthy direction or the anti-drug using direction. And you don't need an elaborate protocol. You don't need multiple sessions to do that. And if you don't have the luxury for that, it's a way to get your foot in the door with behavior change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question that I get actually is when you're thinking about, there is concern about the shortage of treatment resources or the shortage of, I'm just going to say in general, a higher level of care for adolescents. When you're in settings where it's a school nurse or maybe it's a social worker, and they're concerned about asking the questions about substance use because it may lead to the need for treatment or a higher level of care and a referral. And if they're unable to provide that, what are your thoughts in terms of, should they continue to screen despite having a lack of resources? Or is it such that there's an opportunity perhaps to stay with that adolescent over time using just an ongoing brief intervention approach as you're waiting to try to deliver them to care? What are your thoughts on that? Or should they just not screen because they don't have any place to link people?
It is frustrating to do a lot of screening and assessment and realize you don't have a lot of good options when you see these clinical problems emerge. There's one advantage of screening, forging ahead with screening, is what I think you mentioned, Tracy. It does allow a counselor to work with issues that they know are prominent in the clinical picture of the youngster, even though they might not be able to send him or her elsewhere or perhaps get intensive care for those problems. But someone who's good with teenagers, good at low-level CBT light type strategies, I think that can still be a great benefit to a teenager. A youngster who feels like they can at least sit and talk with someone who's a good listener, even though the counselor isn't able to apply a lot of counseling technology, that can be a plus. To know that there's a lifeline out there, I think that's very helpful for teenagers. The other thing is maybe it's leverage that can be used when you realize you have a lot of teenagers with problems and there are not local services for them. If someone has got the wherewithal and the interest in trying to change their local community's landscape in terms of services available, to have some data on the extent to which these kinds of problems are in the teenagers in their community, and being able to document then the big treatment gap and gaps perhaps could be used as leverage to see if that gap can be addressed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. We have that's another a couple of questions here related to another area that comes off quite a bit. I'm sure this will be familiar to you. When you're working with adolescents, with young people, there you have parents may be involved or parents may not be involved, right? And there's confidentiality and privacy issues, and how, and maybe this varies from setting to setting, whether you're in a school or primary care or criminal justice, it could vary. But how are the confidentiality and privacy issues dealt with when you're serving teens? And the question goes on to comment that parents may not be involved in the brief intervention, but potentially could have access to their electronic health record. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a couple general principles, but there's so many different ways to address specific issues. But two general principles: one is a counselor, as best as he or she can, wants to try to maintain private and confidential the information they're getting from a teenager that they can legitimately keep private. And in many instances, the specifics about a teenager's drug use can be kept private. But be careful not to box yourself into a corner. Obviously, there's some issues that you can't keep confidential because they would require mandated reporting. And you may be in some settings where the belief is by the parents that key health information is going to be disclosed to the parent and not kept confidential. And some schools wrestle with that, and they because they want to have, some of them, a very open line of communication about youngsters' health, and they don't want to have so-called secrets in the school that the parents don't know about. But even in those situations where there can't be this kind of full-blown privacy about drug use, I never tell parents the details, or when we work with these programs, we don't tell parents the details. We just talk about how we're trying to get the teenager healthier and we're working on change, and you as the parent can be an agent of change and steer them away from the details. I don't know what value there is in layers of details anyway, and we just remind parents that we're not there to talk about those details. We're there to talk about getting their son or daughter healthier.
Well, thank you, Dr. Winters, and we are going to close our Q&A time together. And if folks have other questions that we didn't get to, I did see a couple, not very many. We got to meet most of them. You're welcome to email me, and I'll be glad to see if I can get an answer for you. And my email, again, was at the beginning of the presentation, so I'm glad to help. If there are tools or other resources or information that were touched upon today that you'd like to get copies of, you are very welcome to email me, and we will do our best to either post them to the website or we can send them to you individually. All right, so we're going to wrap up our time together and just remind folks that all the PowerPoint slides today and all of our webinars are posted on the website. There's a dedicated page for this particular webinar. The CE quiz is available to you at the close. In fact, our technical facilitator behind the scenes has posted some links already to where all of these materials are housed on our website. And I would encourage you to take advantage of the free CEs that we're offering, share information about this webinar today with other folks so they can take advantage of the on-demand learning. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize too is that we're able to bring you this presenters like Dr. Winters and the quality of the information that we've shared to you today because we've been very fortunate that you were willing to submit a brief evaluation form for us. So we are really measured a lot by how many evaluation surveys that we get. So we're going to get a follow-up email. You're also going to have a link posted. You'll see some links over in your chat side. We would really encourage you to take that brief survey. It's really critically important to our funding. And you're going to receive the follow-up email with all the information we've talked about today. So if for some reason you've missed it or don't know what those links are, you're going to get a reminder about where you can find all that information. So again, please take advantage of all the education in our series. Thank you again, Dr. Winters, for joining us and sharing with us today your expertise. And I'd really like to thank all of the partners who have made the education available to everyone. And we do hope that you all will join us in a future webinar. And thank you so much for attending, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much.